Well, my goal is to provoke an interest in you for the book of Judges. I don't want you to be like most Christians throughout the church age that have ignored this book, or just see it merely as in some way these judges prefigure Jesus Christ. They were deliverers, so rejoice, Christ has come, and let's not really dig any further into the book. But the book is here for a purpose for Israel and also for believers as well. Now, as I intimated before the break, that once we get to this concept of why is the book in canon, we come to the first major interpretive issue of the book. And there has been a continuing discussion, not as focused as it has become in the last generation. But as I said, this is the sense of positive, negative in dealing with the book. Just to have the book called Judges, and realizing the positive role that judges were to have within Israel. That they were the guardians of justice. They were the arbiters of making sure that God's ways were followed by His people. That Israel was walking in the commandments of the Lord and therefore reaping His blessing. And the very fact that these judges who judge do so after being raised up by the Lord as military deliverers, as saviors in a military sense that then leads to the proper worship of the Lord, and to a certain extent, fits into those first two chapters of Judges where you have the incomplete military conquest and then the incomplete, obedience of the religious aspects of Torah and passing that on to your children. Here come judges who basically rectify or are raised up by the Lord to fulfill the role given in the Torah, to rectify to the second role, being saviors, being military leaders, generals who win battles of the amazing sort as you go through. There's almost no battle fought in the book of Judges that follows any kind of standard military strategy. Just a reminder again, the victory comes from the Lord, not through military strategy. Gideon and the Midianites is a great example of that. All right, you got to keep getting rid of troops. Your army's too big. All right, now you got 300. That's about right. For you to take on the Midianites. And of course, that's all to show once again that salvation comes from the Lord. Again, it might not be now hailstones from heaven and the sun and the moon standing still. It might not be marching around the city for 7 days, 7 times on the seventh day, and seeing the walls come down. But nevertheless, Judges is also by the narrative of the military events showing that look, the only way you can explain these victories is by the Lord. Even the mud that bogs down the Canaanite chariots in chapter 4. Well, who's the Lord of the storm? Interesting, that's the Canaanites. Their major god is Baal. Baal is the Lord of the storm. But he can't control the storm. To give dry ground to the Canaanites, Yahweh controls the storm. He controls when the rain comes. And the rain comes at the proper time for him to neutralize the Canaanites' chariots so that Israel can win the military victory. These are all the insights you get as you go through, the Judges' battles, that ultimately you can't explain the victory without realizing Yahweh is the one giving the victory. And so these judges begin with being military deliverers who then were to lead the people in the way of righteousness, which of course we're told in chapter 2 never happened. And so we have this, okay, how do we go through the book and read it in a positive sense, or do we go through the book and read it in a negative sense? And the answer is yes. It's a both and, not an either or. Now, classically, and still with the commentators as a whole, the purpose of the book is viewed as a demonstration for the need of the monarchy in Israel. That final statement, in those days there was no king in Israel. And to realize that is not only the conclusion to Judges, but it also is an introduction to the next book, which is going to be Samuel, which is going to be the institution of the human kingship over all of Israel. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And so these judges are prototypes within the tribes of what God wants to do for all Israel. Bring a king who will judge Israel by Torah. By the way, that's the paradigm of the king in Deuteronomy 17, as you remember. And we'll take a look at next week when we get to Samuel. A king, we saw this talking about Josh, was the prototype. A king was to make a copy of the Torah and meditate upon it and have it guide his steps. And so he was to be guided by Torah in all of his activities, and being guided himself by Torah, he would become an instrument of Torah among the people. So in those days there was no king, only judges. And the judges in their persons, and then the lack of response of Israel to them shows the need for a king who can exert authority over all Israel, demonstrating the need for the monarchy. And we could say that this is the purpose of kingship. It's as I will put it, the way Judges fits within the former prophets as a whole. It has a role to play between Joshua and Samuel and Kings. And that's the role, to show the necessity of the human kingship established by God over Israel. But it also shows the need for a national monarch because of the depravity of the people. And this gets into a second emphasis of the book, which is assimilation. And Dan Block has coined a phrase which is now dominates literature on Judges, and that is, in the narratives we see the progressive Canaanization of Israelite society. And he is absolutely correct. That by the end of the book, Israel is acting more like Canaanites than Canaanites. By the way, did you pick up all of the echoes of Sodom and Gomorrah in Judges chapter 19? That's what I mean by you're amazed that Israel still survives. If this had been Sodom and Gomorrah, and this is third generation Israel, God should have obliterated. He should have obliterated the Gibeonites and the Benjamites, who then defend what they have done. And of course, the Benjamites almost are completely obliterated as a tribe. I mean, so many echoes of the Sodom and Gomorrah episode of Genesis 18 and 19 that are in the narrative of chapter 19, really all the way through chapter 21. But particularly chapter 19 with with the Levite and the angels who went to Sodom. The Levite's concubine being given to the crowd in the same way that Lot was willing to give his daughters to the crowd in Sodom, and the angels refused to do so. But there's no angelic presence. There's nothing stopping. In other words, it's even worse than the narrative in Genesis chapter 19. You get an indication in chapters 19 to 21 what would have ensued, if Lot, could have had his way without that angelic intervention, and how disastrous and chaotic the consequences were, which again almost leads to the obliteration of the tribe of Benjamin. But really, in light of Genesis, Gibeah should have been, should itself have become like brimstone and ashes, like Sodom and Gomorrah, and the Benjamites should have been destroyed in the same way as the inhabitants of those cities were as well. Again, it's tempered by the grace of God that allows a city and a tribe to survive. And of course, this is indicative of all Israel during the time of the judges. Well, so he's right. And so we do see the Canaanization of Israelite society after the conquest and settlement of the land, and yet through it all we see God's gracious sustaining. But the emphasis more upon this assimilation. Whereas the first one would say, now how is God using these circumstances, to bring honor and glory to his name. Now on page 292 you have a paragraph from Ruka in The World and the Word on the reason, on the purpose for the book, the reason the book of Judges was written. Can be determined from two major refrains. The Israelites did that which was even the Lord's sight, and in those days there was no king in Israel. And so these two statements show the book is concerned with describing Israel's relationship to God between the period of Joshua and the monarchy. And the overall effect is to call Israel to return to her God from her idolatrous ways, as her position as a holy nation was in jeopardy. And that's only going to come about through the kingship. So it's a both and, not an either or. And the latest edition of Expositor's Bible Commentary, which has come out, argues the same, that it's not a matter of opposing these purposes against one another, that you combine them. Now, I would say this: if you just took Judges out of its canonical context and just read it, beginning in 1:1 through 21:25, just read it as a separate piece of narrative, and not think about its antecedents and what comes after, then I think you are led to emphasize the second aspect. It's a brutal book, relating the consequence of Israel's idolatry, and certainly does emphasize the Canaanization of Israel. But within the greater canon and the former prophets, all right, why does God sustain Abraham? Why does he sustain Abraham's seed? I should say, why does he sustain the Abrahamic promise? Why do he have loyalty to the Abrahamic covenant? Because it prepares us for Samuel and Kings. Because chapter 17 of Genesis, the promise is given to Abraham that kings are going to come from you. In Genesis 4:9, there's going to be a kingship established based upon the Abrahamic covenant in the family of, or in the tribe of Judah. And of course in Samuel we'll find out it's in the family of David. So if Israel becomes like Sodom and Gomorrah, and God deals with Israel like Sodom and Gomorrah, what happens to the Abrahamic promise? It too is obliterated. It's gone. All right, and so within its greater canonical context, we see that yes, we are reading this history to be reminded that God is in control and even directing this history to his ultimate end, which is to bring kings out of the line of David. Out of the line of Abraham. It's going to be through David, because I was already thinking about the ultimate Davidic king who is going to come out of the depths of Israel's depravity as well. And remember, I pointed out that the Abrahamic promise is a great reminder to Israel in exile. We've already seen that in Psalm 105, 106. We'll see it again in the book of Esther at the end of, toward the end of this course. And that also reminds us that this is going to be Israel's hope during the extreme of God's punishment upon them because of their sin, that they might come to know the Lord, according to Ezekiel when we get there, so that in the depths of their judgment during the day of the Lord, they also will be reminded of God's graciousness and compassion because of the Abrahamic covenant. And the ultimate fulfillment of the covenant is still to come. So Judges plays a very, very important role biblically. Now, when we come to, so let me get to my purpose statement. I just try to bring it together. The failure of Israel during the period of the Judges, and their failure is idolatry, which leads to greater and greater abominations. You almost have a repeat of Leviticus 18 and 19, the abominations of the Canaanites that become prevalent among the people of Israel. This failure during the period of the Judges demonstrated Israel's need for a righteous king. That the nation needed what in prototype was seen in the Judges, which is a deliverer who can lead them in the righteous ways of Torah. And the design for the Judges themselves, which never becomes a reality during the period of the Judges, all right, God now is going to start to move in what we see in Samuel to bring about that next step of messianic movement that the latter prophets will anticipate what took place in the past, again being a prototype of what God is going to do in the future. Now, literary structure, the only debate is where the divisions should be placed. The fact that we have a threefold structure in the book of Judges, can I put it this way, gentlemen, is seen by all. Again, right after the purpose on page 292, Rooker gives you an outline that reflects the structure of the book. And it begins with Israel's failure, continues with the cycles of apostasy and deliverance, that concludes with these narratives which show the depths of the failure of Israel. All right, so the fact you got three major divisions, no debate. You're going to take a look at commentary after commentary after commentary. This threefold division of the book is so clear that even your 4-year-old daughter can figure that out. All right, that it's clear you've got, all right, a narrative introduction, the cycle that takes place primarily around these 6 primary judges, and then you got these 2 narratives which reflect on the circumstances that characterized the period of the judges. But Ruka takes a more traditional approach, seeing the first division going from 1:1 to 3:6, with two sections, one ending in 2:5, and of course the second ending in 3:6. Then you come to my chart, and I agree, I am in the minority. Because I see the beginning, the introduction, the narrative of Israel's disobedience. I would see chapter 1 is dealing with the military aspect. Chapter 2 as a whole is dealing with the religious aspect. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, then just becomes an introduction, not only to Othniel, but an introduction to the 6 cycles of these primary judgeships of Israel's deliverance during the period of the judges. And by the way, the pattern of Israel's experiences, this is my way to show the downward spiral. So this was not a mistake on the outline. It's things are going down as you read this narrative. And though there could be a discussion about where it begins, whether 3:1 or 3:7, nevertheless, everyone would see the fact that this is where the heart of the narrative is found. And then in chapter 17 through 21, we now have the epilogue, and I get my D's: Israel's disobedience, Israel's deliverance through the judges, and to keep the D's, Israel's dereliction. That was the worst term I could come up with. So with a D. So there are derelict people. A better term might be an abominable people, a perverse people, a Canaanite type people. All right, but dereliction is my D, so there you go. I'm a preacher, so I got to figure out an alliteration. Now, it is significant, and I give you the chart before the outline. I'm not the first one to see this, and I'm not the last one. There's my notes, and you will notice the same structure that is given to you on page 293 of The World and the Word. All right, so that, again, commentators are agreed that we see echoes. Echoes between the judgeship of Neil and Samson, which interestingly are the two which have a particular emphasis upon their wives, their women. By the way, Othniel obviously having a virtuous wife, Samson having a Philistine wife, and then a Philistine woman that lead to his destruction. Ehud and Jephthah, both who have messages to a king, both who slay at the fords of Jordan. With Barak and Abimelech, who both have a narrative of death by a woman. Now, Barak is not put to death by the woman, but Sisera, the general of the Canaanites, says this was a shameful act to take place in Israel and among the Canaanites. And of course, Abimelech is directly put to death by a woman. So both narratives significantly feature this death by a woman narrative, and then in between we have Gideon. Now this basic chiasm, echoing, is further developed by David Dorsey in his literary structure of the Old Testament, and tying in what is said about Othniel as is introduced in chapter 1, and the narrative of Judah's battles, and them being the first judge in 3:7 to 11. All right, we see more echoes between Othniel and then Samson, and basically all Dorsey does, I've just given you some essential elements of echoing. He brings up even more. And again, this has been shown again and again by different commentators on the book. Which then leads to this narrative in chapters 6 to 8. The second longest narrative section in the book dealing with Gideon. And the only one that is longer is the one dealing with Samson. And Gideon, well, is a most interesting character. He really doesn't want to be a judge. He does everything he can to get out of being a judge. And finally gives up and follows the Lord. Follows the Lord completely in battle, but then starts to have temptation, and in fact begins the process among the judges of starting to fight against his fellow Israelites. Interestingly, some of these picked up by in Jephthah's account as well. And so to use Dan Block's famous statement of an article he wrote, will the real Gideon please stand up? Now we know from Hebrews 11 he's a man of faith, but he's not a man of unsullied faith. But then nor was Barak, and nor are Jephthah and Samson. But certainly there is a movement, and then his son Abimelech becomes a negative example. Everyone recognizes that. And ultimately Jephthah and Samson, though used to deliver, interestingly never really become judges of Israel, leading them in righteousness. And that way we say the evaluation is negative. I like to put it this way: they're the best of what Yahweh had in those generations. And of course, as Israel is getting further and further away from the Lord, the judges also are getting further and further away from the Lord's standard in Torah as well. Yes, these are men of faith and they're men of Yahweh, but they are the best available to Yahweh in those given situations. The stock is getting lower and lower that he can use, for his purposes. Now, getting to the outline of Judges, and I've modified this a little bit to make sure you can, get the situation. What I call the tribal situation, the incomplete conquest by Israel, followed by the religious situation, the idolatry of Israel. And again, at this point, you can take a look at page 293, and Rooker gives, and we use his divisions here or mine, same basic thrust that we have in chapter 1, the foreign wars of subjugation with Haram being applied, that is, to the Canaanites. Already seen some of those echoes. Who will go first? Judah. All right, chapter 1, and again in chapter 20. But then when we get to 21, we have, and this really should start in 19, civil wars with the Haram being applied. All right, now it's being applied not to the Canaanites, it's being applied to the Israelites. It's a whole tribe that is put under the ban and devoted to destruction. All right, so we see very definite echoes because we're dealing with military conflicts and their outcomes. And in both cases, the outcomes are not beneficial for Israel. In chapter 2, we have the difficulties with religious idols, with idolatry. What do we have in chapter 17 and 18? We have a narrative dealing with the establishment of religious idolatry within a whole tribe of Israel. It begins in a family and ends up in the whole tribe of Dan. We have a whole tribe by the third generation dedicated to the worship of idolatry within Israel. That's how bad things get. By the way, it's the tribe of Dan. Which judge came from the tribe of Dan? No implication he himself was involved in idolatry, but who comes out of the weakest tribe of Israel during the period of the judges? Samson. All right, keep those things in mind as you are reading. But this is just a simple symbolization. As you get into the material on Judges, you will see, and even Dorsey, if you wanted to read his comparisons and contrasts between the first 2 chapters and the last 5 chapters of the book. It is significant then that after this introduction, we have the historical cycles, and I deal with the different judges and their opponents. And then we've already talked about in the appendix how we have inverted the echoing of chapters 1 and 2. Now religious narrative comes first, the idolatry narrative, and then the military narrative, which obviously has religious overtones too, because it's a Levite and his concubine. Not a very flattering Levite. You know, these are the men who had 2 functions. A Levite was to help the priests at the tabernacle. And by the way, notice that there is really no priestly or tabernacle narrative given to us in Judges. The priests are absent. We only have one prophet, chapter 10, who is a man of God, who does call Israel to repentance, and they do repent. That's the one place we see repentance on the part of Israel. So certainly, prophetic ministry was rare during the time of the judges. We have priests, we have Levites, but they certainly don't play a predominant role in the narrative. And when we finally do get a Levite, it was when he went to the central sanctuary, supposed to help the priests, with the offerings, and was scattered, throughout Israel to be a testimony to the Torah. Whoa, you read chapter 19 and 20, and we don't have a very good example of Levite ministry during the period of the Judges. So what these last narratives and Judges are preparing us for is basically the whole breakdown of the structure. The judges are not who they should be. The priests are not functioning as they should. By the way, that prepares for Eli and Samuel. We finally will have a priest who's a judge, and as you read, the first 3 chapters, and you read about his judgeship, chapter 4 with the taking of the ark, and Eli's death. Not a very good representation for the Lord within the priesthood. And then you get Samuel being raised up as a prophet because the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Prophecy was not heard much. And so you got these instruments of the way in which the Lord was to function as king and leader within Israel. And you've got a decline in the judges, you've got a decline in the priesthood. We have no prophetic ministry that is emphasized until we get to Samuel. These are sad days as far as Israel is concerned. And it's interesting that this book, which speaks about the religious and social disintegration of Israel, is so highly structured that All right, we might have a few discussions on exactly where divisions begin and end. But the structure is so clear that just reading it through a couple of times, the structure becomes very, very evident. In other words, you've got a book that comes from the Lord that shows coherence and structure, that narrates a nation that was falling apart. Do you see the irony? The narrative is about disintegration, but the order is the structure, the literary structure of the book emphasizes order. In other words, no matter what you read in the narrative, God has not lost control. And so the structure plays a very, very important part in the book and in its narrative. Because tears are going to be coming down your eyes as you're reading the individual narratives, and then you step back and look at the book as a whole, and you realize your tears are wiped away because God never lost control during the whole period of the Judges. So the structure plays a vital role. Well, it does in every book, but particularly here in the book of Judges. We've got to have the same phenomenon in Lamentations. That here is Jeremiah lamenting, weeping over what has taken place in one of the most highly structured books of the Old Testament, just like Judges. In the midst of calamity, there is still order because God is still in control. You see that just like Lamentations, Judges communicates in the same way. As you really get it, you realize don't lose your confidence in Yahweh. Now, if Block and Webb and others are right, and Younger, and Davis, that our contemporary Western culture is best represented by what is taking place for Israel, in the book of Judges, why should you just rejoice in the structure? Because in the midst of calamity and disintegration all around us, what should you be reminded of as you're reading Judges? God has not lost control. There's still an order behind all the disorder that we see. I was having breakfast looking at Sibelius giving her testimony. And of course, those of you who are going to watch this now on, tape, this might be ancient history by the time you watch it, but she was giving her testimony about, all the calamities that have happened to the website. Everything's gone wrong. And I thought, what a great illustration of our whole society. Our whole society is like the website. It's one catastrophe after another. It's just one calamity after another. And the best minds can't put it back together again. I thought, what a wonderful metaphor. What a wonderful picture. And so she's here, I'm sorry, we're doing the best we can. Yeah. And I'm going, well, that's always, calamity after calamity, we're doing the best we can. But you know what? God's in control. The computer might be down, but God is in control. That's what you get. And I thought, what a wonderful way to prepare for teaching Judges this morning. So there you go. That's how I thought. By the way, I was eating with others. I didn't have any choice what was on the TV. I just had to listen. I thought, well, Lord, you have a reason for me listening to this. It's getting me ready for teaching Judges. All right, bibliography. And notice now I've added a second star. This has been updated since what you downloaded. The new work by Barry Webb in the NICOT. Reading it, and he gives high accolades to the discussion by Dan Block in the NAC as well. I would still say Block maybe still has the better discussion. That's. I just read through the introduction last night of Webb. Certainly has a lot that you can fill in for Block. This point, I'd be hard pressed. I still think probably the first read, for you is better with Dan Block's NAC, which is first and foremost written for preachers. Although Dan Block can never do something simple. It's always very, very detailed exegetically. But as Webb says, his commentary is simple, but he's got a lot of material in his footnotes for scholars. Webb also is sought to write, not so much for pastors like Block, preachers, but for those who just want to study, you're, again, educated layman, and puts a lot of his technical material in footnotes as well. But I think you're going to find a lot of benefit by reading Block first and then filling in information that's also in Webb. And Trent Butler's work on Judges, I believe, is stronger and better than his work on Joshua. Although, again, still a little more tinged with some of the liberal ideas, and I would want an evangelical, but certainly less of that here in his Word Biblical Commentary than was in Joshua. And then again, Dale Ralph Davis's outstanding exposition, Judges, So Great a Salvation. And then Kent Younger's work in the NIVAC is also a very, very good work based upon more of a Blockian type of exegesis, and then he also talks about contemporary application, and you're going to find these commentators basically on the same page as the meaning of Judges and its contemporary application. In fact, their coherence is, you'd almost think it was something of the Holy Spirit. And I think will convince you of the importance of the book and the importance of preaching the book. So these are excellent resources. As I said, all have been published in the last 22 years. Every one of these books. Butler just came out 3 or 4 years ago. Webb has just come out in the last 18 months, etc. So these are now fine resources. You have no excuse for not preaching Judges. Now, what are the other two major interpretive issues of the book? And again, the chronological problem is dealt with in the world and the word. It's also dealt with in your reading in about 5 pages of Merrill's work, 160 to 170, 166 to 170. Those 5 pages, he introduces you to the problem, and 291 for the world and the word. In a nutshell, I've given you a chart. Here's the problem. The problem is, as you go through the book of Judges, you begin obviously with the death of Joshua and then the elders who came after Joshua. So approximately 30 to 40 years after the conquest began, 1406 BC, we're looking at the end of that era and the beginning of the third generation, which is the beginning of the period of the Judges. All right, in the book of Judges, all right, we have the primary judges. And indented, I've also placed, based upon the narrative, the secondary judges as well. I've also given you the tribes from which they came. And by the way, notice that in most cases, we know from which tribe these judges came. Their first identification was with their tribe, not necessarily with the nation of Israel as a whole, as we've brought out, going back to Exodus chapter 18. I've also placed the oppressors that God raised up against the 6 primary judges. and then the years of oppression followed by the years of rest after the military victory by the specific judge. Adding the years of oppression, the years of rest, and adding them together, we get a total of 410 years. But as I've said, the institution of judgeship continues in the early narrative of Samuel through the first 7 chapters. And we have 2 more judges, Eli and Samuel, both, interestingly, from the tribe of Levi. And in Eli's case, we have an indication of how long he was a judge. In Samuel's case, we really have no data given to us, but we would assume that with Eli and Samuel, we are dealing with at least 60 plus years, which added together equals about 490 years if the judges narrated in Scripture are to be seen as coming in consecutive order. All right, and here is the problem from our knowledge of extra-biblical chronology and even biblical chronology. 480 years of 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. And then even going back, 4th year of Solomon, following a 40-year reign of David, following a question mark. We don't exactly know how much with Saul, but most will say somewhere between 20 to 40 years, which leads to the kingship of Saul beginning, I would say, taking the 40 years at about 1050 BC. All right, and then we've got to, all right, already at 1050 BC, we continue on to add back the 480 years, as we've seen, to the Exodus, 40 years after the conquest, 1406 BC. Probably a good starting point, as we've said, for the period of the judges around 1375 BC. We have 325 years for the period of judges, but we have about 490 years given within the text. Now remember, we got the number of 325 from Scripture. The 480 years between the Exodus and the beginning of the temple. All right, and so what we have to realize is the Bible itself has given us this chronology. It's not extra biblical data. But what do we do with the period of the Judges? Well, the book of Judges itself shows us that we should not necessarily take everything in strict chronological sequence. Take a look at chapter 3, 31. After him, after Ehud, came Shamgar, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he also delivered Israel. So as a military deliverer, nothing is said about any kind of judgeship which follows. So when did this take place? Notice chapter 4, verse 1. Then the sons of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So Shamgar, and of course no years are given for him, but in some way he's added, but he's not part of the consecutive narrative. Shows in some way that maybe this came during the years of Ehud. Now, if that is true of the first of the secondary judges, maybe the same thing is true as we get to Tolar and Jehor, etc. That their years also are in some way combined with these other primary judges. and even the last two primary judges, can I put it this way, that seem to have the same starting dates as far as the oppression and then their ministry is concerned. Notice in chapter 10, verse 6, familiar refrain, the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. And the anger, verse 7, of the Lord burned against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the sons of Ammon. So his response to this idolatry was both the Ammonites and the Philistines. The Ammonites to the east, the Philistines to the west. Interestingly, Jephthah is going to become the judge who is raised up to bring deliverance from the Ammonites. Samson will be raised up in chapter 13 and following to begin the deliverance from the Philistines, which actually is going to be completed by Samuel when we get to 1 Samuel chapter 7. So it would seem, going back to our chart, that the 18 years of oppression before Jephthah comes upon the scene and the 40 years of oppression before Samson comes upon the scene begin in the same year. There's an overlap. At the same time, because of their sin, he was sold in the hand of the Ammonites for 18 years, was also the beginning of Solomon in the hands of the Philistines for 40 years as well. This again gets us to a realization that what the judges did was for the benefit of all Israel, but primarily, first and foremost, they were deliverers for whom? Their individual tribes. And Jephthah and Samson have an impact, come from different tribes, have impact upon different tribes within Israel. Yet obviously what they do brings a benefit to the whole nation. Which means, and there's multiple solutions depending upon where you look, 3 different solutions, the MacArthur Study Bible and the chart of background and chronology of the Old Testament, and Merrill's Kingdom of Priests. When the period of the judges begins, how exactly they see the overlap and put it together. Kitchen, and I got to show you this because Kitchen takes a late date, so he really has an overlap. This is the chart that he gives, and notice for him the period of the judges all begins in different places right around the period of about 1180 to about 1140, 1130 BC. And so he broadens everything. You got what's taking place in the south and the center and the north and the east among the different tribes, and he plots all of all the judges and says, when you start to see this overlapping, I can get all the judges not only in 325 years. He basically gets the whole of the judges in about 175 years. But once you got overlapping judgeships, you can overlap them. Now, I'm not sure that he's right, but because I think his basic chronological scheme is not accurate. But and even Webb, I was surprised. I thought Webb, being British educated, I was going to assume he was going to be a late datist. And interestingly, he said on the basis of biblical data, he leans also toward the early date. Amazingly, I mean, here's a guy who's been schooled in late date for the Exodus. And writes his commentary and says, when you put it all together, it seems chronologically the best sense is made of the early date after all. So there you go. That should bring rejoicing to your heart for the rest of the week. All right, so the solution is overlapping judgeships, and I'm not going to commit myself to an exact chronology. I'm not sure we can put it together with the data we have today, both biblically and extra biblically. But I do believe the period of the Judges is between approximately 1375 to right around 1065 to 1050 BC. How close Samson and Samuel overlap, I don't know, but certainly this is where the period of the Judges is approximately 300 to about 310, 315 years.